You wake up and grain becomes bread before you even open your eyes. A truck moved that wheat 500 miles overnight. A machine folded it into dough. You have never once thought about where that power came from. You just eat. For 99% of human history, there was no power like that. There was only muscle, human muscle, and nothing else. One person, one hoe, one small plot of dirt. That was the ceiling on civilization for 250,000 years. Then around 10,500 years ago, in the hills of what is now southeastern Turkey, something changed everything. Humans began domesticating the aurochs, a wild ox nearly 6 feet tall at the shoulder, strong enough to kill a lion. Genetic research led by archaeologist Melinda Zeter and geneticist Ruth Bolongino traced almost every modern domestic cow back to a founding herd of fewer than 80 wild females, 80 animals. That is the entire genetic bottleneck standing between you and every burger, every glass of milk, every leather shoe on Earth today. But domestication alone did not build a single city. For nearly 6,000 years after that first taming, oxen were mostly just meat on legs. Archaeologist Andrew Sherratt called what happened next the secondary products revolution. Around 4000 BCE, humans stopped only eating the animal and started harnessing it. Milk, wool, and most importantly, muscle, hitched to wood. A farmer with only a hoe could work about 1 acre in a season, exhausting, backbreaking, and slow. A farmer with a single ox pulling an ard plow could work up to 10 acres in the same time. 10 times the land, 10 times the grain, 10 times the surplus from one single animal walking in a straight line. Now, some of you are thinking, wasn't it agriculture itself that built the first cities, not the ox? Fair question. But agriculture without traction power has a hard ceiling. Every civilization that farmed by hand alone stayed small, scattered, and fragile. It was the ox that broke the ceiling. Look at Mesopotamia. Around 3500 BCE, the city of Uruk exploded from a small farming village into a walled settlement of roughly 40,000 people, one of the largest concentrations of humans the world had ever seen. That growth was not magic, it was calories. Ox-drawn plows turned river mud into surplus grain, and surplus grain meant that not everyone had to farm anymore. Here's the part that stops most people. When a society produces more food than it needs to survive, something strange happens to human beings. People stop farming and start specializing. Some become potters, some become soldiers, some become priests. And in Uruk, around 3200 BCE, some became the world's first scribes, pressing wedge-shaped marks into wet clay. Cuneiform, the first true writing system on Earth, was invented largely to track something specific: grain, livestock, and labor debts. The ox did not just plow the field. The ox may have plowed the ground that writing grew out of. Picture the comparison directly. A prehistoric village of hoe farmers, maybe 150 people, everyone growing their own food, everyone equal in labor, nobody free to specialize. Now picture an ox-powered city, tens of thousands of people, most of them never touching a plow in their life, freed instead to build walls, cast bronze, paint pottery, and count debts on clay tablets. Same species, same brain. One single animal standing between those two futures. The pattern was not unique to Mesopotamia. In Egypt, tomb paintings from the Old Kingdom, some dating back to 2600 BCE, show oxen dragging wooden ards through the black silt of the Nile floodplain, the same silt that fed the labor force building the pyramids at Giza. In the Indus Valley, at sites like Mohenjo-Daro, terracotta figurines of yoked cattle dated to around 2500 BCE sat right alongside evidence of granaries large enough to feed tens of thousands of people. 3 separate civilizations, 3 separate continents worth of geography, and the same animal shows up in every single one, pulling the same plow, feeding the same surplus. Now compare the timelines directly. Cities without reliable animal traction, Like many early farming settlements in the Americas before horses and oxen arrived with European contact, stayed smaller and more dispersed for far longer, often capped at a few thousand residents for centuries. Cities with the ox in Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Indus Valley crossed the 10,000 person threshold within a few hundred years of adopting ox-drawn traction. The variable was not intelligence, it was not culture, it was raw pulling power, harnessed to a wooden frame. Archaeologists found the proof of this shift pressed into an unlikely object. The Bronoses pot, discovered in Poland and dated to roughly 3,500 BCE, is decorated with the oldest known image of a wheeled vehicle, pulled almost certainly by oxen. Around the same centuries, plow scratch marks began showing up preserved beneath burial mounds across Europe and the Near East, permanent fossilized proof that the ox, the plow, and the wheel arrived together as one single package of power. And the ox gave humans something else too: transport at scale. Building a city wall, a ziggurat, or a temple required moving enormous quantities of mud brick, timber, and stone. A human could carry perhaps 50 pounds on their back for a few miles before exhaustion. An ox could drag a sledge loaded with over 1,000 pounds day after day without complaint. Every great monument of the early Bronze Age, from Mesopotamian temples to the causeways of early Europe, was built on the backs, quite literally, of domesticated cattle. Here is the direct comparison laid bare. Without the ox, small villages, capped populations, no surplus, no specialists, no writing, no cities. With the ox, surplus grain, freed labor, specialization, monuments, and eventually the entire architecture of civilization as you know it. One species of animal, every skyline on Earth traces back to it. Some researchers push back and argue that sheep, goats, and donkeys played similar roles in other regions, and they are right, partially. But nowhere else does a single animal show up so consistently in so many independent civilizations, from Mesopotamia to the Indus Valley to Bronze Age China, always doing the same job, pulling the plow that fed the surplus that built the wall. Some people assume the horse did this job first, since horses feel faster and more heroic in the imagination. But the horse collar, the harness design that lets a horse pull heavy loads without choking itself, was not developed until roughly the 5th century CE in China and did not reach Europe for centuries after that. For nearly 10,000 years before that invention, the ox, wearing a simple wooden yoke across its shoulders, was the only animal strong enough and patient enough to be trusted with the heaviest work of civilization. The horse got the glory in later myths and later art. The ox did the actual founding. By the time of the Sumerian king lists, cattle were so central to civilization that laws were written specifically to protect them. The Code of Ur-Nammu, one of the oldest legal codes on Earth, dated to around 2100 BCE, includes specific penalties for injuring or stealing an ox, placing the animal's value on par with certain human labor disputes. A society does not write laws to protect something it considers replaceable. Compare that to the penalties for damaging a simple tool, like a hoe or a basket, in the same legal tradition. Those items carried no special protection at all. Only the ox stood in that unusual space between property and partner, valuable enough to require its own dedicated line of law. So think again about this morning. That truck that moved 500 miles of wheat overnight is not a replacement for the ox. It is the ox's great-grandchild, 10,000 generations removed, wearing a different shape, running on a different fuel, but doing the exact same job an aurochs did in a field outside ancient Uruk. 99% of your species' story was written by muscle alone, and then for the last 1%, it was rewritten by an animal willing to lean into a yoke. You did not build the modern world alone. No human civilization ever has. Every wall, every scroll, every skyline you have ever stood beneath was raised, one furrow at a time, on the back of an animal that never once knew it was making history,